Montana Territory, 1885. The wide-open sky pressed down on the town of Silver Creek like a heavy hand. Thomas Xavier stood at the edge of town, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. At 26, he had the lean, hard body of a man who worked cattle from dawn till dusk, his shoulders broad beneath his worn chambray shirt. His face was handsome in that distinctly Western way, weathered at the edges from squinting into the sun, a day's worth of light stubble shadowing his strong jaw, but his blue eyes remained clear and sharp as the mountain streams. Thomas adjusted his hat and sighed. The frontier had taken everything from him, his parents to disease, his brother to outlaws, and he'd learned one truth that kept him alive. A man stands alone in this world. Attachments were dangerous out here where death lurked behind every craggy butte and in every darkened saloon corner. The frontier was no place for love, it was a place for survival, nothing more. Thomas. There you are, the voice belonged to Elijah Stewart, owner of the Crossed Spurs Ranch where Thomas had worked as foreman for the past 3 years. Been looking all over for you, son. Sorry, Mr. Stewart. Just checking that shipment that came in on the afternoon stage. Well, I need you at the house tonight. Rebecca and her friend from back east are arriving, and I want you to join us for supper. Elijah's eyes twinkled with something Thomas couldn't quite place. That's an order, not a request. Thomas nodded, knowing what this was about. Rebecca Stewart was Elijah's niece, a refined Boston lady who'd been writing to her uncle about coming west. Thomas had seen the letters, seen the delicate handwriting, and smelled the faint perfume that clung to the paper. He'd also heard Elijah's not-so-subtle hints about what a fine match his niece would make for a promising young ranch foreman. "I'll be there, sir," Thomas said, though his stomach nodded. He needed this job, needed the respect he'd earned, but he didn't need entanglements. Still, one dinner wouldn't hurt. Hours later, Thomas stood uncomfortably in the Stewart parlor, freshly shaved, hair dampened and combed back, wearing the only good shirt he owned. He was just adjusting his string tie when the women entered. Rebecca Stewart was exactly what her letters had suggested, slender as a willow switch, with perfectly arranged blonde curls and a complexion like porcelain. Her blue traveling dress accentuated a narrow waist that Thomas guessed couldn't be more than 18 inches, even without a corset. At 22, she was the picture of Eastern refinement. "Miss Stewart," Thomas said with a slight bow. "Welcome to Montana." Rebecca extended a gloved hand with practiced grace. "Mr. Xavier, Uncle has told me so much about you." But it was the woman behind Rebecca who caught Thomas's attention and held it. June O'Brien stood slightly apart, as if used to remaining in Rebecca's shadow. At 24, she was what folks might charitably call substantial, certainly not slender like her friend, with soft, rounded curves that her sensible green dress did little to disguise. Her rich brown hair was pinned in a simple but elegant style, framing a heart-shaped face with large, expressive hazel eyes. She wasn't trying to be tiny like Rebecca, she simply existed, solid and real. "And this is my dear friend, Miss June O'Brien," Rebecca said, her tone suggesting June was something of an afterthought. June stepped forward and offered her hand. No glove, Thomas noted. Her fingers were warm and slightly calloused, working hands, not idle ones. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Xavier," she said, and her voice carried the lilt of Ireland, generations removed but still clinging to the edges of her words. When Thomas took her hand, something unexpected happened. Their eyes met, and for one unsettling moment, Thomas felt as if she could see straight through to the loneliness he kept buried beneath layers of self-sufficiency. He dropped her hand quickly, retreating behind the wall he'd built. "Ladies," he said curtly, nodding to both but looking at neither. Throughout dinner, Rebecca dominated the conversation with tales of Boston society and questions about the ranch that she clearly hoped would elicit romantic stories of cowboy heroism. Thomas answered politely but briefly, his attention repeatedly drawn to June, who ate with unabashed enjoyment and laughed without covering her mouth with her hand, as Rebecca did. "And what brings you to Montana, Miss O'Brien?" Thomas finally asked during a rare lull in Rebecca's monologue. June looked surprised to be addressed directly. "I teach school in Boston, but the position here in Silver Creek opened unexpectedly." Rebecca was already planning to visit her uncle, so we traveled together. Her eyes met his again. I believe children need education, even perhaps especially on the frontier. Most folks here are just trying to survive, Thomas said, more harshly than he intended. Is survival all there is, Mr. Xavier? June asked quietly, and Thomas felt that unsettling sensation again, as if she were reading words he'd written on his heart. Before he could answer, Rebecca interjected with a story about a scandalous affair in Boston society, and the moment passed. But throughout the evening, Thomas found himself watching June, the way she listened attentively when others spoke, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the unself-conscious way she occupied space in a world that seemed to prefer women small and ornamental. That night, riding back to his cabin on the ranch property, Thomas tried to shake the image of June O'Brien from his mind. Rebecca Stewart was exactly the kind of woman a man in his position should court, beautiful, refined, connected to the ranch owner. She was also the kind of woman who would need constant protection from the harsh realities of frontier life. June O'Brien, with her sturdy frame and practical manner, seemed better suited to the Montana territory, but she wasn't what men dreamed of when they thought of taking a wife. Thomas reminded himself it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for a wife anyway. The West had taught him that lesson well enough. Attachment only gave death something to take from you. The following Sunday, Thomas sat in the back row of the Silver Creek Church, fulfilling another of Elijah Stewart's expectations. The small wooden structure was packed with ranchers and townspeople in their Sunday best. Thomas had just settled in when he saw June enter, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out flecks of blue in her hazel eyes. She carried a stack of books and papers, no doubt materials for her teaching position. When she spotted the only remaining seat, beside Thomas, she hesitated only a moment before walking over. "May I?" she asked. Thomas nodded, shifting slightly to make room, though there was plenty on the bench. Even so, when she sat, he was acutely aware of her presence, of the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the gentle press of her skirts against his leg. Halfway through Reverend Miller's sermon on faith in times of tribulation, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts and the thunder of hooves broke the Sunday quiet. Thomas was on his feet before anyone else could react, instincts honed by years on the frontier. "Stay here," he ordered, not just to June but to everyone, as he drew the revolver he carried even to church. In Montana, you never knew when trouble might find you. Outside, 5 riders were galloping down the main street, firing pistols into the air and laughing. Thomas recognized them immediately, the Blackwell gang, small-time outlaws who'd been terrorizing smaller settlements throughout the territory. "This town is now under our protection," shouted the leader, a greasy-haired man named Deke Blackwell, "and protection costs money." Thomas stepped into the street, gun steady. "Move along, Blackwell. Silver Creek doesn't need your kind of protection." People were streaming out of the church now, despite his orders to stay inside. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw June emerge, her face set in a determined expression that suggested she wasn't the type to cower indoors during trouble. Deke Blackwell spotted Thomas and reined his horse to a stop. "Well, look who it is, the righteous Thomas Xavier." His smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Still playing hero. Didn't work out so well for your brother, did it?" The mention of his brother sent a cold rage through Thomas, but he kept his voice level. "Last chance to ride away, Deke." The outlaw's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over, Xavier." He wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back when you're not expecting company." The gang galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and tension behind them. Thomas holstered his gun, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. When he turned, June stood nearby, watching him with those too perceptive eyes. "You knew them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Knew of them," Thomas corrected, not meeting her gaze. "Every lawman and ranch hand in the territory knows the Blackwell gang." "He mentioned your brother." Thomas stiffened. "Church is probably resuming," he said curtly, turning away. But June's hand on his arm stopped him. Her touch was gentle but firm. "I lost my parents in a tenement fire when I was 16, she said quietly. "I understand something about loss, Mr. Xavier. And about carrying it alone." Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. There was no pity there, only recognition, one survivor recognizing another. "My brother was shot by Blackwell 2 years ago," Thomas said, the words coming unbidden. "I was supposed to be with him that day, but I'd stayed behind to help a neighbor with a difficult calving." June didn't offer empty condolences. She simply nodded, her hand still on his arm. "That's why you keep everyone at a distance," she said. "You think it's safer that way." Thomas withdrew his arm from her touch. "It is safer that way, Miss O'Brien, for everyone." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas found himself making excuses to ride into town. He told himself it was to check on supplies, to watch for the Blackwell gang, to deliver messages for Elijah Stewart. But each time, he found himself passing by the small schoolhouse where June taught. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her through the window, moving energetically as she taught, her face animated in a way that transformed her from merely pretty to something luminous. Once he arrived just as school was letting out and watched as she stood on the steps, saying goodbye to each child by name, straightening a cap here, praising a drawing there. One small boy with a dirt-smudged face lingered, and Thomas saw June kneel, unmindful of her skirts, to speak to him at eye level. She produced an apple from her pocket and pressed it into the child's hand. The boy threw his thin arms around her neck, and June's face, as she returned the embrace, held such tenderness that Thomas had to look away, feeling as though he'd witnessed something almost too intimate to bear. During this time, Rebecca Stewart made her interest in Thomas increasingly clear. She arranged to ride with him across the ranch property, asking questions about cattle breeding that were transparent excuses to spend time in his company. She was beautiful, accomplished, and clearly accustomed to male attention. Any sane cowboy would have been flattered. Thomas was polite but distant, which only seemed to increase Rebecca's determination. After one such ride, as they returned to the main house, she placed her hand deliberately on his as he helped her dismount. "You're a puzzle, Thomas Xavier," she said, looking up at him through her lashes. "Most men would be falling over themselves for a chance to court me." "I'm not most men, Miss Stewart," Thomas replied, stepping back to a respectful distance. "And I'm not looking to court anyone." Rebecca's pretty face hardened momentarily before she composed herself. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Not that June girl, surely. She's sweet enough, I suppose, but hardly the type to catch a man's eye." The dismissive way she spoke of June stirred something protective in Thomas. "Miss O'Brien seems a capable woman," he said neutrally. "Oh, June's quite capable," Rebecca agreed with a light laugh. "She's had to be, poor thing, with her figure and modest circumstances. But men don't marry for capability, do they? They marry for beauty and refinement." She patted his arm. "Don't worry, I'm patient. You'll come around." That evening, Thomas rode into town with the excuse of checking the telegraph office. As he passed the schoolhouse, he saw a light still burning inside despite the late hour. Concerned, he dismounted and approached quietly, one hand resting on his revolver. Through the window, he saw June at her desk, surrounded by papers, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked by lamplight. As he watched, she pushed a strand of hair back from her face with an ink-stained finger, then massaged her neck, clearly tired but determined. Thomas meant to leave unnoticed, but his horse nickered softly, and June's head snapped up. Their eyes met through the glass, and after a moment of surprise, she smiled and motioned him inside. "Mr. Xavier," she said as he entered, removing his hat. "What brings you to the schoolhouse at this hour?" "Saw the light," he replied, suddenly feeling foolish. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Just preparing lessons," June said, gesturing to the papers spread across her desk, "and grading compositions. The children are writing about their dreams for the future." She picked up one paper. "Billy Thompson wants to be a cattle baron with 1,000 head of longhorns. Mary Jenkins wants to be a doctor, though her father says that's not for girls." "What did you tell her?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. June's eyes lit up. "I told her about Elizabeth Blackwell, no relation to your outlaw friends, who became the first female doctor in America. I wrote away for information about medical schools that accept women." Thomas found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. And what did little Mary say to that? She asked if she could still have babies if she became a doctor. June laughed, a warm, uninhibited sound that filled the small schoolroom. I told her she could have anything she was willing to work for. There was something about June in that moment, passionate about her students, unembellished, genuine, that caught at Thomas's chest. "What about you?" he asked, moving closer to her desk. "What are your dreams, Miss O'Brien?" June looked down at the papers before her, suddenly self-conscious. "I want to build something lasting," she said quietly. "This school, these children, I want to give them more than just reading and figures. I want them to see possibilities beyond what this frontier has shown them so far." "The frontier isn't kind to dreamers," Thomas said, but there was no edge to his words this time. "Perhaps the frontier needs dreamers most of all," June replied, looking up at him. "Otherwise, what are we all fighting to survive for?" Thomas had no answer for that. Instead, he said, "It's getting late. Let me walk you home." June gathered her papers. "That's very kind, but I can manage." "I'm sure you can, Miss O'Brien, but there's been talk of the Blackwell gang in the area. I'd feel better seeing you safely home." Something in her expression softened. "Then I accept, Mr. Xavier, thank you." As they walked through the quiet streets of Silver Creek, Thomas found himself telling June about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west with his parents and brother, about the hard years of establishing themselves in Montana territory. June listened without interruption, asking questions that showed she was truly hearing him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston's Irish Quarter, about losing her parents and being taken in by a childless aunt who emphasized education as the path to a better life. She spoke of teaching in overcrowded city schools before hearing about the position in Silver Creek. "Rebecca thought I was mad to accept," June said as they reached the small house she rented near the church. "She came along partly to convince me to return to Boston and partly because," she stopped abruptly. "Because," Thomas prompted. June hesitated, then seemed to make up her mind. "Because she'd heard so much about you from her uncle's letters, she decided you would make an advantageous match." She looked at him directly. "Rebecca usually gets what she wants." Thomas felt a strange relief at June's honesty. "And what about you, Miss O'Brien? Do you usually get what you want?" In the moonlight, June's face was soft with shadows. "I've learned to want what I can have, Mr. Xavier. It saves disappointment." Without thinking, Thomas reached out and touched her cheek, just briefly. "Perhaps we both need to dream a little larger." The next morning, Thomas was checking fence lines in the north pasture when he heard a horse approaching. It was Elijah Stewart, looking unusually serious. "Telegram came for you," the older man said, handing Thomas the yellow paper. "Ryder brought it out from town." Thomas read the brief message, his face hardening. "Blackwell gang robbed the bank in Graycliff. 2 men dead." Elijah nodded grimly. "Marshall's gathering a posse. Figured you want to join, considering your history with them." "I'll ride out immediately," Thomas said, already turning his horse. "Thomas," Elijah called after him. "Be careful, vengeance is a poor companion on the trail." The posse, 6 men including Thomas and Marshall Jenkins, rode hard for 2 days, following the Blackwell gang's trail north toward the Canadian border. On the evening of the second day, they spotted smoke from a campfire in a sheltered canyon. "We'll wait until dawn," the marshal decided. "Better light for shooting and they'll be sleep-heavy." But as the men settled in for the night, Thomas slipped away. He told himself he was just scouting, getting a closer look at their position, but in his heart he knew he was seeking the man who'd killed his brother. He crept to the edge of the outlaws' camp, close enough to hear their drunken boasting about the Graycliff robbery. Deke Blackwell sat apart from the others, counting money by firelight, his greasy hair hanging in his face. Thomas drew his revolver, sighting down the barrel at the man who had haunted his dreams for 2 years. One shot, that's all it would take to end it, to avenge his brother. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then, unbidden, June's face came to him. "What are we all fighting to survive for?" she had asked. If he pulled this trigger now in cold blood, what would be left of the man he wanted to be? What dreams could be built on such a foundation? Thomas lowered his gun slowly, his hands shaking not from fear but from the force of his own restraint. He backed away carefully, returning to the posse to report what he'd seen. At dawn, they surrounded the outlaw camp. "Blackwell," Marshal Jenkins called out, "you're surrounded. Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up." What followed was chaos. The outlaws scrambled for cover, guns blazing. Thomas found himself pinned down behind a boulder, exchanging fire with two of Blackwell's men. From across the clearing, he could see Deke trying to reach the horses. "Blackwell's making a break for it," he shouted to the marshal. Without waiting for a response, Thomas darted from cover, firing as he ran. A bullet creased his arm, but he barely felt it, focused entirely on stopping Blackwell. The outlaw leader reached his horse and swung into the saddle. Thomas fired, hitting Blackwell in the shoulder, but the man kept riding. Thomas grabbed the nearest horse, not his own, and gave chase. The pursuit led up a narrow mountain trail, dangerous at any speed but deadly at a gallop. Thomas could see Blackwell just ahead, weaving drunkenly in the saddle, losing blood from his wound. As they rounded a sharp bend, Blackwell's horse stumbled, sending the outlaw tumbling over the edge of the cliff. Thomas reined in hard, dismounting quickly to look over the edge. 20 feet down, Deke Blackwell lay on a narrow ledge, conscious but badly injured. "Come to finish me, Xavier," Blackwell called up, his voice tight with pain. "Like I finished your brother." Thomas could leave him there to die slowly. No one would know, or he could put a bullet in him now and call it justice. Both choices clawed at him, demanding satisfaction. Instead, Thomas uncoiled his rope from his saddle. "I'm bringing you up to stand trial," he called down. "Hold on to the rope if you want to live." Blackwell's laugh was a broken sound. "You always were too soft, Xavier. Should have killed me when you had the chance." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, securing the rope, "but that's not who I want to be anymore." When Thomas returned to Silver Creek 3 days later, the Blackwell gang locked up and awaiting transport to the territorial prison, he was greeted as a hero. Elijah Stewart clapped him on the back, Rebecca fluttered around him admiringly, and even the town's most taciturn residents nodded respectfully as he passed. But it was June's reaction he sought, and she was nowhere to be found. He finally located her at the schoolhouse, teaching despite it being Saturday, helping 3 children who needed extra attention with their reading. Thomas waited outside until the lesson finished, watching through the window as June patiently guided a small girl through a difficult passage, her face alight with pride when the child succeeded. When the students had gone, he knocked on the door. June looked up, her expression changing from surprise to relief to something more guarded. "Mr. Xavier, you've returned safely." "Thanks to luck and good companions," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "We captured the entire Blackwell gang." "So I heard, the town's talking of nothing else." June began gathering her books, not quite meeting his eyes. "You must be very satisfied to have caught your brother's killer." "I thought I would be," Thomas said slowly. "But when I had Blackwell at my mercy, something changed." June looked up then, searching his face. "What happened?" "I remembered what you said about what we're fighting to survive for." Thomas moved closer. "I realized I didn't want vengeance to be my only legacy. I want to build something too, June, something lasting." Her eyes widened at his use of her given name, Thomas. "I know you think I should court Rebecca," he continued, unable to stop now that he'd started. "Everyone thinks that. She's beautiful and refined, and exactly what a man in my position should want." "But," June prompted softly, "but every time I'm with her I find myself looking for you." Thomas took her hands in his, books and all. "You challenge me, you see me, not the cowboy, not the ranch foreman, just me. And when I'm with you, I see possibilities I never allowed myself to consider before." June shook her head, though she didn't withdraw her hands. "Thomas, be sensible, Rebecca is." "Not the woman I think about day and night," he interrupted. "Not the woman whose laugh makes me want to be better than I am. Not the woman I rode into that outlaw camp thinking about, whose face kept me from becoming a murderer." June's eyes glistened with unshed tears. People will talk, they'll say you chose wrong. Let them talk, Thomas said firmly. I've spent my life believing the frontier is no place for love, that attachments only lead to loss. You showed me there's more to living than just surviving. I'm not slender and graceful like Rebecca, June said, one last protest. Thomas smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek. You're strong and real and exactly what I need. If that makes me a fool in others' eyes, so be it. I'd rather be a fool with you than wise and alone. June laughed then, a sound of disbelief and joy mixed together. You do realize you haven't actually asked me anything yet. Thomas grinned, suddenly boyish despite the healing cut on his cheek and the weariness of the trail. Miss June O'Brien, would you do me the honor of walking out with me? I can't offer much yet, but I'm saving to buy my own piece of land, and I promise you'll never face this frontier alone as long as I draw breath. Yes, June said simply, her smile outshining the tears that now spilled freely. Yes, Thomas Xavier, I will walk out with you, and wherever this frontier takes us, we'll face it together. 3 months later, Thomas stood before the Silver Creek Church, wearing a new suit and the first tie he'd ever owned outright. Beside him stood Elijah Stewart as his best man, the older rancher having surprised everyone by giving his blessing after his initial shock wore off. You're sure about this? Elijah had asked when Thomas announced his intentions. Rebecca was quite displeased. I've never been more sure of anything, Thomas had replied. Now, as the small church filled with townsfolk and ranchers, Thomas felt a certainty that had eluded him his entire adult life. When the door opened and June appeared on the arm of Reverend Miller, standing in for her departed father, Thomas couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. June wore a simple white dress that followed the curves of her body without apology. Her brown hair was adorned with wildflowers instead of an expensive veil, and her face glowed with a happiness that made everyone who saw her think her beautiful, regardless of what they might have thought before. As she reached him at the altar, Thomas took her hands in his. You're sure, he whispered, giving her one last chance to reconsider binding herself to a simple cowboy. June's smile was radiant. I've learned to want what I can have, she reminded him, squeezing his hands. And I can have you, Thomas Xavier, if you'll have me. For all my days, he promised. 1 year later, Thomas stood on the porch of their small house, built with his own hands on the 10 acres he'd purchased from Elijah Stewart. June sat in a rocking chair beside him, their 2-month-old daughter Catherine asleep in her arms. The sun was setting over land that was finally and truly theirs, a modest ranch that would never rival the crossed spurs in size, but was already prospering thanks to Thomas's skill with cattle and June's careful management of their finances. In town, her replacement at the school was doing well, though many children still came by the house for extra help with difficult lessons. Any regrets? Thomas asked, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder as they watched the alpenglow paint the distant mountains rose and gold. June looked up at him, then down at their sleeping daughter, then out at the land that had once seemed so harsh but now felt like home. Not one, she said. You. Thomas shook his head, leaning down to kiss her softly. Only that I wasted so much time being afraid to love. He touched Catherine's downy head, but we have a lifetime to make up for it. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Xavier knew that he had found something far more precious than vengeance or isolation. With June and Catherine, he had found his true frontier, not a place of endless loneliness and struggle, but a journey shared with all its joy and pain and wonder. And in the end, that was what the West was truly about. Not just surviving its harshness, but building something worth surviving for.